So now what we're going to do is I'm just going to talk about some things about science in general. So this is all related to biology, but it's about, all science. And science isn't, just any one field. There are all sorts of different fields that are considered scientific. So from biology and chemistry and physics to astronomy and geology. Basically, these are fields where there's some types of investigation of the natural world. So the focus is on the natural world. And that's kind of the key here. So there's a natural world focus. And although technology and computer science, could be a thing, there's certain aspects of that, as well that kind of tie into the study of the natural world, but they're sort of separate because they follow some of the same processes. And that's the thing about science, is that a lot of people think about science as being just a lot of information to like learn and memorize, and there is, right? So there's a whole body of knowledge, terminology that is associated with different types of science. So if you're a chemist, you're going to have to know about nomenclature, how to specifically name different chemicals and rules that are essentially associated with that. In biology, there are all sorts of terms, and there are many people who are biologists who have biology degrees who don't know all these different terms. And so one term comes up and many people don't know because it's maybe a unique technique done in a laboratory, and the person works in the field with the fish. They collect them, they do population biology and ecology of trout. So they don't know this particular lab technique. So everyone doesn't know everything in science who's a scientist. They often know their particular field and the terminology and the knowledge around that. But it's nice to have a broader understanding of how these things connect, because that's just it. All these things do connect in one way or another. So biology is an interesting science in that it really combines a lot of different fields into one. So there's a lot of chemistry in biology, right? There's from physics, in biology, say biomechanics, how organisms move. And how even just, your blood vessels work, and how fluid is transported in plants. These are based on different physical, properties. So there's a whole bunch of different combination of areas of science combined into biology. And so each of them has their own set of terms and terminology, and you can't really discuss these things with other people unless you know them. So there is a certain amount of information that has to just be memorized, terms to be learned, sort of like a language, so you can speak to others about science and understand it. When you read that word, you kind of know what it means. But that's not all that science is. Science is sort of a method, or maybe I'll do this. Some people say a way of knowing. So it's not just about knowledge, it's about how we know what we know, which is really about, process. So that's a lot more what science is about, and that's a lot more what unites all the different types of sciences, is something about process. And that's what I'm going to have as the sort of the main focus, and I'm going to highlight a few terms, specific terms that are important that you know, especially terms that are commonly misunderstood throughout society. So but most people use wrong, misunderstand, and because they misunderstand these terms, make poor decisions and draw conclusions that are just really wrong, simply because you just didn't really understand the true meaning of this word and how it's used by science or scientists. So science as a process, it really starts off with the key to everything is about observation. I'll erase that there. We observe things in the natural world, things that happen, and then we ask questions. Why is the sky blue, or why is the grass green? And there are answers, for these things. The light gets refracted through the atmosphere. Light contains, the spectrum of visible light, the Roy G. Biv, and the blue light is what we can see up in the air and based on the way it's bent through the atmosphere, and that's a whole different sort of class. It's not this class, but there's an answer to that. Why are plants green? Well, they have pigments in them, and there's going to be a little bit in this class. You're going to actually do a lab with pigment chromatography. You're going to analyze some plant pigments as part of the class, but they have different chemicals in them that absorb light and reflect light, and they actually don't use green light very much, so they reflect it back. They use the other wavelengths, the other colors, and so we see the plants as green because they have these green pigments. They use them for other things, but they're not absorbing the light energy, or they're not in the same way that some of the others are. So you kind of get this idea that there are often then some answer, but many times there isn't an answer. So we ask a question and we search for an answer. The answer may be already known, so you can search for it and find it in scientific literature. Somewhere published, someone had this question, and then they investigated, and then they performed an investigation. And so this is sort of what you're doing here as well. The investigation could be a literature investigation. You have a question: how does this work in biology, or what is this organism? You try to look it up. You find, I can't find it anywhere. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just not published. Maybe you're not looking in the right place. Maybe it's unknown. Maybe it's never been described before. But you usually start off with something that investigates what do we know already, and see if this is known. And if we find out that it isn't known, we can't find it in the literature, we start to try and answer the question ourselves. All right. So we might perform tests to do that. Related to this testing, we may come up with ideas. Sort of before we design a test, it has to have some point, or purpose to it. Like what exactly though are we going to test? How are we going to investigate this? So usually people will come up with, I'm going to use a different color here because I think that blue isn't great. A hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis is really just a scientific idea. Okay, so this is, I think this is the reason why this happens. So we'll give you just a really simple example. It's not biological. You go to start your car, no power. Nothing happens. Whether you turn a key or push a button, nothing. There's no sound. There's nothing at all. And you try it again, nothing happens. Okay? So you made an observation, the car doesn't start. Your question is, why doesn't it start? And with that sort of observation, you see that there doesn't appear to be any power. So that's kind of part of this. You're getting an idea as to why, to answer that question. So you might say, my battery is dead. So the battery's dead. That's what you conclude. Except you should probably test the hypothesis. So you could have someone come and call somebody, they jump your vehicle, but they might look at it and say, hey, wait, your battery is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with the battery. Maybe there's something else. So then it's different part of the vehicle, a starter or a spark plug. There's something else that's not right. There's a wire that's just not connected. But you have to first you have a hypothesis, an idea. Then you test it. You kind of measure the battery's charge. You say, oh yeah, there's no charge in the battery. So you were correct. So you would then accept the hypothesis as the explanation. So after you test it, the hypothesis leads to this explanation. However, if you test it and it doesn't lead to an explanation, then you would go back to creating a new hypothesis. You say, oh, geez, the battery isn't dead. What else is there? Let's check all the wires. So you check all the wires. They seem to be connected. That hypothesis is refuted after the investigation. And you go again and again. And this is what scientists do. They might say, here's a whole bunch of shrimp, and they all live together, but these shrimp seem bigger than the other shrimp. Maybe they're a different species of shrimp. So they investigate and they look genetically at the shrimp and they find, they're the exact same. Genetically, there's no difference between these shrimp, but yet for some reason this group is much larger than the other. Maybe it's something else. Maybe, it's just a male-female difference. Maybe the males are larger than females, or vice versa. And they find, nope, not really. There's males and females in both groups, small and large. What else is there? Is there some other thing that's different about them that's causing this kind of size? So you investigate and then start to collect information, and then that either is going to support your idea or then refute it, and then if it's refuted, you go back and test it again. So science is this kind of constant process, and it's not just a straight line. It's not go from here to there and then end. Science is also constantly in a process of being tested and retested and tested again. So over here, I kind of wrote some of this down. Testing ideas is central to every type of science that there is, especially biological sciences. Usually what we'll find out is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. Right? So you investigate something, you find something out, but that leads usually to more questions. So your answer gives more questions, and then you investigate that, and that usually leads to more questions. It's not a straightforward path to an ending where you just understand things. That's just not really reality as far as especially biology goes. Some other fields, we'll talk a little bit about this, say in math and physics and all, there's more, there's things beyond what people explain with our basic physics, but people constantly continue to retest those things as well. But we can often use mathematical equations to solve specific problems, and the math works out, and that's it. Although people still retest those and sometimes find that years later, there's some unknown factor and it has to be redone again. But generally, in certain fields, there is somewhat of an end point where it's explained, not simplistically, but in a mathematical way that's very concise. In biology, it's much more broad of an explanation of how these things occur, and it requires much more complicated explanations, which requires a lot of ideas. So once you have an idea and you test these things, it goes usually to the scientific community. So it goes to other scientists who are performing similar kinds of work, and they look at how you attempted to answer that question, and they may come up with, some comment on your experiment, your design, which is something I'll also be covering. How did you test it? Maybe your test wasn't a good test. Maybe the way it was designed was poor. There are certain things, especially in the lab part of this course, you're going to be conducting experiments, and you're going to be having to have things like replicates and controls, which means you don't just have one thing and then make an observation and that's what you draw a conclusion on. You have to have same organism maybe, but under different conditions, and you're comparing the conditions. Maybe one condition is a normal condition that you've investigated through literature. This is sort of the temperature, this is the light level, those things. And then you manipulate some other factor, and so you have these other testing conditions, and you draw conclusions. But other scientists may say, that's not the right approach, that's not the best approach, we think you should have done it differently. Or they say, this is interesting, this is really helpful and valuable. And so then they either give you that feedback and it's good and we get some kind of outcome from that and understand something a little bit more, or it gets thrown back and you say, okay, now I have to redo the investigation again, retest it, maybe in a different way. So that's constant back and forth. There is no path here. You can see I've drawn arrows all over the place. There's no arrows to memorize, say with this drawing. It's essentially that they all lead in all directions because there's this constant sort of idea, testing, feedback. The feedback leads to more ideas, which leads to more testing, and all those sorts of things just kind of keep going on and on and on. The idea is to try to get at some kind of explanation for nature. We can answer a question, so we can, take this hypothesis or this idea that we've tested and support it, with evidence. Support with, and this is the main idea here, so this hypothesis, this idea, right, it has to be testable, right? So or I could put it this way too, you're testing the hypothesis. If you have an idea, like let's say your car won't start, and then your idea is, it must be ghosts. They don't want you to start your car. Well, can you test it? If you have a way of testing that, then I guess it's, it starts to come into the science. But if you don't have some mechanism that's a true ghost detecting apparatus, which I would like to have, but I don't, and I don't know that it really exists, except for the Ghostbusters, right? But we can't test that. So that's technically not science. It's what people refer to as pseudoscience. So it's like, it's not really science. It's something that you're going through like some of the scientific process, but there are things that are unproven. There is no literature to support it. There are ideas that sometimes, in some cases, there are many great scientific discoveries that people thought the people doing these things were insane, right? And completely wrong. And it turns out over time, they were actually right. And this thing they had that all other scientists just said was ridiculous, turns out they eventually gathered evidence and supported it, and then it became accepted, as an explanation. And that's the other idea. You support this with, so you need evidence. If you can't get evidence, you can't really draw conclusions, okay? Or because you need something to support those conclusions. So this whole idea is that for it to be accepted, right? Okay, an accepted explanation. This is a big part of the terminology that is greatly misunderstood, okay? The accepted explanation for a natural phenomena in science is called a theory. So I'm going to actually erase this thing over here so I can write a little bit more. So like I said, you're not going to need to draw this or anything, so don't necessarily worry about that. This is just more to give you this idea of how scientists explore things, they make observations, they ask questions, they design experiments to test ideas, they're reviewed by other people, they come up with outcomes that we accept it, we don't accept it, it goes back to testing, people might discover a new thing. It's just kind of a constant back and forth process that involves different people, different fields sometimes kind of overlap one another. And it's all kind of all going on, at the same time. All right. So this term, theory, I'm erasing this, I'll keep talking here, is greatly misunderstood in society, and it's one of the reasons we have so many problems with people who are non-scientists not understanding science. Okay. Because you ask anybody in your family, what's a theory? And most everyone's going to say, well, a theory is just some idea I have. I got this theory about why that guy's always, walking down the street. It's your idea, which is technically your hypothesis. So you could, not that I'm telling you to follow some person around, but the idea, you test it, you collect information, you make observations, you kind of have an idea, so you find out. You find out what is the explanation, you find out, I was right, or I was wrong. So you either support it with evidence or you refute it, and then that wasn't the right explanation. Once enough scientists have reviewed information as an explanation for something, they may start to accept and form a theory. So a theory is the accepted explanation, and I'm rewriting this here, but I'm going to, but it's really important. For a natural phenomena, which is pretty broad. All right, so the writing here is a little off, but you can kind of get the idea here. This is a scientific theory. Is the accepted explanation, and really emphasize here, the currently accepted, this is currently, I know it's a really weird end, the currently accepted explanation for a natural phenomena. So something that happens in nature that we observe, and then investigations have taken place, hypotheses were tested, evidence was collected, it was reviewed by many different people. It went back and was reinvestigated again and again and again. And over time, people accept then this is the explanation. And at that point, it is called a theory, which to you may not sound right. You might say, well, maybe, what, isn't it a law then? I mean, right? So I'm going to talk about that. So the difference between, I'm not sure why they're not, there we go. A theory and a law. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about here. Now, this is up here long enough, and I've talked about it, that you should be able to have that information. You can always go back and rewind if you want that as well. Okay, so scientific theories are these explanations for natural phenomena, and I'm going to give you, say, an example. So something called cell theory. And this leads right into the next lecture, in the course, as well, because we're going to talk about cells and prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. We're going to start to then build the cells with the structure from their chemistry. So, we're going to then regress a little bit back into atoms and elements and putting the molecules together to actually build the cell. But we're going to be talking about cells. So, all living things, this is a biology class, we're talking about living things, are or are made up of cells. So that's called cell theory. Is that just some idea? No, cells are alive. We're made up of cells. All multicellular things are made of cells. Plants and fungi, all made up of cells. Protists that are multicellular, like giant kelp, they're made up of cells. There's a lot of single-celled organisms, amoeba and paramecium, and there's zillions of all kinds of protists that are classified and unclassified even. They're single-celled organisms. All the bacteria and archaea forming 2 domains of life, they're all single-celled organisms. Well, there's nothing alive that's smaller than a cell. A virus is not alive. It doesn't do metabolism. It doesn't have any of these mechanisms that a lot of things we're going to talk about in this class doesn't have. Right? It's not considered to be alive, although it may have originated from a parasitic cell at some point that lost all of its mechanism and then it's just left with genetic information. But that's a separate story, right? So all living things are cells. That's called cell theory. All cells come from other cells. Right? Yeah. Cells divide. A cell divides, there's 2 cells, and those cells divide, there's more cells. Cells come from other cells, right? So obviously there's a separate story as well on the origin of cells, which we'll get into in this course a little bit. First cells maybe, how they came about. We don't know that for sure. That's more of a hypothesis that's constantly being tested, as much as it can be, based on evidence that people collect, that they add into that explanation to kind of figure out, how that all happened, all right? So we call this the cell theory, but you can see these are not just guesses or maybe or something we need to test. We know these things. They've been tested for a very long time. You could look under the microscope and you could watch one cell divide and become 2 cells, right? And you could look at anything that's alive and see that it's made up of cells. We have the evidence to support this. And it's called not cell law, but cell theory, because biological theories are much more wide-spanning and they're bigger explanations. The difference, say, is a law. A law. There's an upside down. All right, W there. Right. A law is generally more specific, or at least more specific, than a theory. So it doesn't explain a whole big, gigantic process. It's usually a lot more specific, and it's mathematical. So math is used specifically. Usually the entire law is explained in an equation. You can't just write an equation for cell theory or evolutionary theory. So that's the idea. See, people always, some people still do today, but people have for a long time always said, oh, evolution, that's just a theory. It's like, well, that's because you don't understand what the word theory means. If it's just a hypothesis, yeah, then that's just an idea that hasn't even been tested or is being tested, but hasn't really been accepted. A theory is the accepted explanation supported by evidence. and it gets retested. So it's very important, supported by evidence. And it gets tested and retested and retested and retested and retested. And that's the other thing about science that you have to understand. Scientists and good scientists do not try to prove their theories correct. The proper way of conducting science is to try and disprove your ideas. You're working to prove that your ideas are wrong, okay? And the idea is if you can't do that, then we accept your explanation for now, like I said, currently, because there's no other explanation. And then we test other things, and we test other things, and we test other things, and if we can't find alternate explanations, then we continue to accept this as an explanation, right? So I said that testing was the central part of science, so you just kind of keep over and over and over again testing and testing and testing. So I talked a little bit of, hypothesis, skipped a little bit here about theory and law, questions, and evidence. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these other things, before I finish this up. All right. So we will go over sort of steps of what's called the scientific method as you design experiments and follow some experiments that I've designed for you in the lab part, right, of the course. One of the problems with that is whenever you read about, what is science, it's always going to be talking about the scientific method, right, which is usually, you make an observation, you ask a question, you design an experiment, so you're testing a hypothesis, and then you decide, whether you make a conclusion, and that conclusion either supports the hypothesis or doesn't, and then you go back and then you do another experiment, and it goes back and forth. That's usually called hypothesis testing. And it repeats, but that's not all science, right? So the original scientists were natural historians. So they observed and reported. And you will find today there are countless scientific papers that are published and peer-reviewed by others that are nothing more but a report of observations. So we talked about, this idea of exploration. People explore an area, they find something new, they catalog it and report it. There's not a hypothesis being tested. There might be information collected, so like data collected, but it's not necessarily to refute anything. It's just saying, who lives here? I'm going to collect a survey of insects, and I'm going to report it in this area. These are the insects that were collected. Period. That's it. There's no more to it. That falls in a realm of what's often described as natural history. So we're describing nature, right? And it doesn't involve it. And there a lot of modern work does this as well. So say the field of genomics. So what that sounds kind of, we're going out in the wild collecting plants and identifying them. So that sounds like, simplistic. And that's what natural history then must be, and that types of observation. But we say genomics, the study of gene sequences. So like the ATGC sequences of genes in an organism. Well, a lot of scientists have millions of dollars of grants to study gene sequences of organisms. Their work isn't really testing hypothesis many times. I mean, sometimes they can eventually if they're doing comparisons between this group and that group, and they're saying, are they similar, are they different? So they're asking questions. A lot of times the studies and the publications are simple descriptions. The genome of this organism, and that's the study, and it just presents, here we go, starting at the beginning of this chromosome, here's the sequence. Here's the next chromosome, here's the sequence, here's the third chromosome, there's the sequence. Maybe this organism only has 3 chromosomes. You kind of could have questions of how many chromosomes do they have, and what is their gene sequence, but really you're not necessarily testing that. We know that they all have DNA, so you're just describing it. It's very descriptive. So in a way, that's kind of like a molecular biology aspect of natural history. In a sense, it just is a description of life, of nature, of something, but this is on a biochemical level, something more specific. So not all science involves experiments and hypothesis testing. A lot of science in the past and a lot of science today still involves description based on observations. And so some of it might be more sophisticated than others, but that's a whole part of science as well, and it's a totally valid and important part of science and discovery of things. So that, again, that was part of that whole process I talked about before. And I think that's kind of, we hit on pretty much all the things here, right? So people will explore new places, they'll explore things within the cells to try to find out, what is there, but just in describing that, then they might come up with questions and ideas, and then that could lead to hypotheses. So eventually theories can be formed that explain things, and the theories are accepted. So theories and laws, again, are actually pretty similar in terms of their level of it's not like a law's above a theory. That's not the case. It's not like it's more accepted. That's not the way it is. Theories actually encompass way more often information than a law does. It's just that a law is very specific and mathematical, whereas a theory is much more broad and usually has a fairly complex investigation. Both of them can be investigated and refuted potentially over time, or revised. And so science is a lot about revision. We test and we test and we test, and we support, but when we don't, then people revise things. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing to revise it, to update it with the most current information as technology changes, and we can investigate new things. So science is a non-stop, ongoing process. There's never really an ending to it. So it's just constantly a study of the natural world, and really at the center of almost all of it, I would say the key to all science and being a scientist or being scientific has to do with questioning, asking questions. If you don't ask questions, then that's kind of the opposite of science, right? So scientists want to know why, right? So you're injured, your foot hurts. Here's Advil, to make the pain go away. That's not scientific, right? A scientist would say, why does it hurt? You say, I don't know. The scientist says, let's find out. Let's see. Let's investigate to see why your leg hurts, because then we can really prevent the problem, as opposed to treating a symptom that then just kind of recurs over and over and over again, right? So that there's a certain aspect of medicine that we talk about as being science, but there's often a non-scientific approach to the way most people are treated medically. Most people should be treated, if they were treated scientifically, you would investigate the root cause of everything and go after that, not just a symptom and then just leave it at that. So asking questions about everything, and everyone is kind of born with that. Kids are always asking questions, and then many times they're people who don't know the answers, they kind of discourage them from asking questions. I don't know the answer to that. So you just kind of have enough people tell you they don't know, you stop asking the questions. But that's the idea. Science, you just keep asking. Everything I say, in the class, you should be asking, how do you know? Is that right? That's you. So I'm going to give you other resources like a book to look up. So you check it. You fact check. What I said. Don't just take every single thing as, well, he said it, so it must be true. That's not scientific. Scientific is, he said that, sounds good. Let me check it here and see. Then you verify, with literature. So even consider studying for a course, a way of applying science, or a process, to learning, as you investigate. And the thing is, the more involved you are in investigating, the more you'll retain, the more you'll actually learn from the course. If you just sit and numbly kind of listen to information, it's kind of going to pass through. But if you go back and check, say fact check some of the information, that's when you're really going to remember it, learn it. So that's what I encourage you to do throughout the whole course. Always be, double checking everything, looking things up, doing the readings, because that's going to help support everything that you learn.